I never believed in fate until the night I found him dying on the side of the road. It was October, and the rain had been falling for 3 days straight. The kind of rain that doesn't just soak through your clothes but seems to seep into your bones, making everything feel colder, heavier, more desperate. I was driving home from my shift at Memorial General Hospital, my eyes burning from exhaustion, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles had gone white. 16 hours. That's how long I'd been on my feet, moving from one emergency to another, watching people fight for their lives while I did everything in my power to keep death at bay. But death always wins eventually. That's what I'd learned in my 7 years as an IE doctor. You can delay it, trick it, bargain with it for a little more time, but in the end, it comes for everyone. Or so I thought. The highway was empty that night. Just me, the rain, and the rhythmic thump of my windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. I was maybe 10 miles from home when my headlights caught something on the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. We got a lot of roadkill on this stretch of highway. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was a person. A man, sprawled face down in the mud, rain hammering against his motionless body. My doctor instincts kicked in before my common sense could tell me to keep driving, to call 911 from the safety of my car. I pulled over, grabbed my emergency med kit from the trunk, and ran through the rain toward him. The first thing I noticed was the blood. So much blood mixing with the rainwater, creating dark rivers that snaked across the asphalt. The second thing I noticed was that he was barefoot. His feet were torn and bleeding, like he'd been running through broken glass. And the third thing, the thing that should have sent me sprinting back to my car, was how cold he felt when I touched his neck to check for a pulse. Not cold like someone who'd been lying in the rain. Cold like something that had never been warm to begin with. But there was a pulse. Faint, irregular, barely there, but present. I rolled him onto his back, and that's when I saw his face. Even covered in mud and blood, even with his skin pale as death, he was beautiful. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, dark hair plastered to his forehead. He looked like he belonged in a painting, not bleeding out on a highway in the middle of nowhere. His eyes flickered open for just a moment. That's when I saw them properly for the first time, those eyes that would haunt every decision I made from that night forward. They were an impossible color, somewhere between crimson and gold, like embers burning in the darkness. They found mine, held them for a heartbeat, and then closed again. I should have left him there. I should have called for an ambulance and waited at a safe distance. But something in those eyes had reached inside my chest and wrapped around my heart. Maybe it was the loneliness I saw there. Maybe it was the resignation, like he'd already accepted his death and was just waiting for it to arrive. Or maybe it was something darker, something I didn't want to admit even to myself. The fact that I'd spent the last 3 years living in a self-imposed exile, pushing away friends, family, any possibility of human connection, and this stranger's suffering felt like a mirror of my own. I made a decision that would change everything. I dragged him to my car, somehow managed to get his limp body into the back seat, and drove him to my house instead of the hospital. Even now, I can't fully explain why. I told myself it was because he'd looked terrified when I mentioned calling 911. I told myself it was because something about his injuries seemed wrong, unnatural, like they'd been inflicted by something other than a car accident or a simple assault. I told myself a lot of things that night. But the truth? The truth is that I'd been alone for so long, had pushed everyone away so thoroughly, that the idea of this stranger in my house, dependent on me, needing me, was intoxicating in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. My house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by woods on 3 sides. It was exactly the kind of place someone chose when they wanted to be left alone. I'd bought it 2 years ago. after the incident that made me realize I couldn't work alongside people I'd once called friends. The isolation had felt like safety then, and now, as I struggled to carry an unconscious stranger through my front door, it felt like I'd built my own prison. I took him to the guest room, the one I never used, the one that still had furniture from the previous owners. I laid him on the bed and started cutting away his clothes. His shirt was shredded, revealing dozens of wounds across his chest and back, deep gashes that should have required immediate surgery. But as I cleaned away the blood and examined them more closely, I felt my hands start to shake. The wounds were closing. Not slowly, not with the formation of scabs and the beginning of scar tissue. They were actively knitting themselves back together as I watched, skin pulling across torn muscle, flesh regenerating at a rate that shouldn't have been possible. I spent the next hour in a kind of daze, cleaning and bandaging wounds that barely seemed to need my help, monitoring a pulse that grew stronger with each passing minute, trying to convince myself that I was hallucinating from exhaustion. By the time I finished, the rain had stopped, and pale morning light was starting to seep through the curtains. He still hadn't woken up. I sat in the chair beside the bed, watching his chest rise and fall with each breath, and tried to decide what to do next. Call the police? Tell them what, exactly? That I'd picked up a stranger with impossible healing abilities and brought him to my isolated house? Check him into the hospital under a fake name. Abandon him here and pretend this never happened. I did none of those things. Instead, I locked the guest room door from the outside, went to my own room, and collapsed onto my bed, still wearing my rain-soaked clothes. I woke to the sound of breaking glass. The sun had set while I slept. My bedroom was dark except for the moonlight streaming through the window. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. Then another crash came from the guest room and everything came flooding back. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside my bed and crept down the hallway. The guest room door was still locked, but I could hear movement inside. Slow, careful, like someone trying very hard not to make noise. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, bat raised. He was standing by the window. The mirror that had hung on the opposite wall was shattered on the floor. He'd wrapped one of the bed sheets around himself like a makeshift toga, and he was staring at his hands like he'd never seen them before. In the moonlight, his skin seemed to glow with an otherworldly pallor. He turned when he heard me, and those eyes, those impossible crimson gold eyes, fixed on me with an intensity that made me take an involuntary step back. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I realized I was still holding the bat, pointing it at him like it would do any good if he decided to attack. He spoke first, his voice rough and low, like he hadn't used it in a very long time. He told me his name was Lucian Blackwood. He asked me where he was, how he'd gotten here, and why I'd helped him. I explained about finding him on the highway, bringing him back to my house, treating his wounds. I didn't mention the impossible healing. I didn't mention my suspicions. Not yet. He listened silently, his face expressionless, those strange eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, he walked slowly to the bed and sat down, his movements careful, controlled, like someone who'd forgotten how to be human and was trying to remember. He told me I should have left him on the road to die. He said that I'd made a terrible mistake by bringing him here, by keeping him alive. He explained that he'd been attacked by others of his kind, that they'd left him for dead, and that when they discovered he'd survived, they would come back to finish what they'd started, and anyone who helped him would become a target too. I asked him what he meant by others of his kind. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked back to the broken mirror and picked up one of the larger shards. He held it up, angling it so the moonlight reflected off its surface. Then he positioned it so he should have been able to see his own reflection. There was nothing there, just the wall behind him, the window, the moonlight, but no reflection of the man holding the mirror. I should have screamed. I should have run. I should have done anything except what I actually did, which was lower the bat and ask him to explain. Maybe I'd been alone too long. Maybe the exhaustion had finally broken something in my brain. Or maybe, deep down, I'd known all along that something about him was wrong in a way that transcended normal human understanding. Lucien told me his story in a voice devoid of emotion, like he was reciting facts about someone else's life. He told me he'd been born in 1847 in a small village in Romania. He remembered dying of typhoid fever at 23, remembered the fever dreams, the sense of his life slipping away. And then he remembered waking up 3 days after his funeral, clawing his way out of his grave, consumed by a hunger he'd never known existed. He'd been made into a vampire, turned by a creature he never saw, for reasons he never understood. He'd spent his first few years as a monster, learning what he was, what he needed, what he'd become. He'd killed. He told me that part without flinching, without asking for forgiveness. He'd killed because that's what vampires did. They hunted, they fed, they survived. But somewhere around the turn of the century, something had changed. He'd watched the world transform around him, had seen empires fall and rise, had witnessed atrocities that made his own predatory nature seem almost quaint. And slowly, over decades, a question had started to form in his mind. What was the point of immortality if you spent it as a parasite? So he'd made a choice. He'd sworn an oath to himself that he would never again take a human life to sustain his own. He would feed on animals, on the blood of creatures that couldn't comprehend their own mortality. And if that wasn't enough, if that meant he would grow weak and eventually fade away, then that would be his penance for the lives he'd already taken. I listened to all of this standing in the doorway of my guest room at 3 a.m, and the strangest part was that I believed him. Every impossible word. Maybe it was the way he talked about centuries like they were years. Maybe it was the absolute absence of his reflection. Or maybe it was the look in those ancient eyes, a weariness so profound it seemed to have its own gravity. I asked him what had happened on the highway, why he'd been attacked. His expression darkened. He explained that other vampires considered his oath a weakness, an insult to their nature. To them, he was a traitor, a coward, something that needed to be eliminated. They'd tracked him down 3 nights ago, a group of 4, led by an ancient vampire named Severin who'd known him in his early years. They'd given him a choice: renounce his oath and feed properly, or die. He'd chosen death. They'd tortured him for hours, draining his blood, breaking his bones, ensuring he'd be too weak to heal properly. Then they'd dumped him on that highway, assuming the sun would finish what they'd started. But the rain had come, providing enough cloud cover for him to survive until I found him. He told me all of this matter-of-factly, like he was describing a medical procedure. Then he looked at me with those impossible eyes and said I needed to turn him out immediately, before Severin and his group realized he'd survived, before they came for both of us. I should have done exactly that. Instead, I heard myself say that he could stay. The words surprised us both. Lucien's eyes widened slightly, the first real emotion I'd seen from him. He asked me why, and I didn't have a good answer. I told him that I was a doctor, that my oath was to preserve life in all its forms, that I couldn't, in good conscience, throw an injured patient out onto the street. But we both knew those were just excuses. The truth, which I barely admitted to myself, was that I wanted him to stay. This creature from another century, this impossible being who'd chosen mercy over survival, who carried the weight of his sins like a cross, fascinated me in a way nothing had in years. For the first time since I'd isolated myself in this house, I felt something other than numb resignation. So Lucien Blackwood moved into my guest room, and the strangest period of my life began. The first few days were awkward. I'd go to work at the hospital, spending my shifts in the familiar rhythm of trauma and emergency, and return home to find him exactly where I'd left him, sitting motionless in the dark guest room. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, barely seemed to breathe. Sometimes I'd catch myself watching him from the doorway, trying to detect any sign of life beyond the occasional blink or the slow rise of his chest. Gradually, we developed a routine. I'd come home, make dinner for myself, and sit in the living room. Eventually, he'd emerge from the guest room and sit on the opposite end of the couch, maintaining a careful distance. At first, we didn't talk much. I'd read or watched television, acutely aware of his presence while he sat in absolute stillness. But slowly, as the days turned into weeks, conversation began to happen. Not the small talk of strangers, but something deeper. He'd ask about my work, and I'd find myself telling him about patients I couldn't save, mistakes I couldn't forget, the guilt that had driven me into isolation. And he'd listen with an intensity that made me feel truly heard for the first time in years. In return, he'd tell me about history. Not the version taught in schools, but the real lived experience of watching civilization evolve. He'd describe the gaslight streets of Victorian London, the trenches of World War I, the fall of the Berlin Wall. He'd known writers whose books I'd studied, had witnessed events that I'd only read about, had lived through the entire span of modern history as an observer trapped on the periphery of human life. What struck me most wasn't the fantastic nature of his stories, but the loneliness embedded in them. He'd spent nearly 2 centuries essentially alone, unable to form lasting connections with beings who would age and die while he remained unchanged. His oath had made that loneliness even more profound. By refusing to feed on humans, he'd severed his last real connection to the vampire world, making him an outcast among outcasts. I recognized that loneliness. It looked different from mine, but it came from the same place, the belief that true connection was impossible, that isolation was safer than risking the pain of loss or betrayal. One night, about 3 weeks after I'd brought him home, I came back from work to find him standing in the kitchen, staring at the refrigerator. Not opening it, just staring, like he'd forgotten what people used refrigerators for. I asked him if he was okay. He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, weaker somehow. He told me that he'd been surviving on animal blood for decades, that he'd managed to maintain a semblance of strength, but that Severin's attack had taken more from him than he'd initially realized. Without proper feeding, he wouldn't fully recover. He'd continue to weaken, slowly but inevitably, until he lacked the strength to move, to think, to exist in any meaningful way. I asked him what proper feeding meant. He turned to look at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Fear. He explained that vampire strength came from human blood. Not just any human blood, but fresh blood, taken directly from a living person. Animal blood could sustain basic existence, but it couldn't provide the vitality needed for healing, for maintaining the supernatural abilities that defined what he was. To truly recover, he would need to break his oath. He told me he'd made peace with dying, that he'd lived long enough, seen enough, carried enough guilt. If this was how his story ended, slowly fading away in a stranger's house, then perhaps it was fitting. I remember standing there in my kitchen, still wearing my scrubs, my hands shaking slightly from the double espresso I'd had an hour earlier, and feeling an emotion I couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even sympathy. It was something closer to recognition. I'd been doing the same thing he was doing, choosing a slow death over the risk of truly living, choosing isolation over the possibility of being hurt, building walls so high that nothing could reach me, not pain, not joy, not connection, not life. I asked him if he wanted to die, really wanted it, or if he was just too afraid to live. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he told me he didn't know anymore. The weeks that followed saw a shift in our strange household. Lucian grew visibly weaker. His skin, already pale, took on a translucent quality, like parchment stretched over bone. His movements became slower, more careful. Sometimes I'd find him sitting in the same position for hours, staring at nothing. And I'd wonder if he'd finally slipped into whatever passed for death for his kind. But every evening when I came home, he'd still be there, still existing in that strange liminal space between life and death. We talked more during this time. Without the distraction of television or books, we'd sit in the dark living room and just talk. He told me about the people he'd loved and lost. The human woman he'd fallen for in the 1920s who died of tuberculosis. Before he could find the courage to tell her what he was. The young soldier in World War II he'd saved from bleeding out, only to watch him die in another battle 2 weeks later. The child he'd pulled from a burning building in the 1980s, whose subsequent nightmares about the pale man who'd rescued her had haunted him for decades. In return, I told him about my own ghosts. The patient I'd lost through a stupid, preventable mistake my second year as an attending. The colleague who'd reported my error, destroying my reputation and career trajectory. The slow realization that I'd become someone I didn't recognize, someone defined entirely by that one failure. Unable to forgive myself enough to move forward. Lucian listened to all of this without judgment, without offering empty platitudes. When I finished, he simply said that we all carry our dead with us. The question is whether we let them bury us, too. It was during one of these conversations that I realized I'd fallen in love with him. Not the romantic, movie version of love. It wasn't about attraction or desire, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel both. It was something deeper. A recognition of kinship between two profoundly damaged creatures who'd found temporary shelter in each other's presence. An understanding that we were both standing at the edge of an abyss, and the only thing keeping us from falling was the fragile connection we'd built in my isolated house. I never told him this. What would have been the point? He was dying, slowly but surely, and I was the coward who watched it happen without offering the one thing that could save him. Until the night Severin came. It was December by then, nearly 2 months since I'd found Lucian on that rain-soaked highway. I'd just finished a particularly brutal shift, a multi-vehicle accident that had filled every trauma bay in the R. I was numb with exhaustion as I drove home, my hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash. The house was dark when I arrived, nothing unusual about that. Lucian rarely turned on lights. I parked in the driveway, grabbed my bag, and headed for the front door. That's when I noticed the door was already open. Not broken open, not kicked in. Just open, swinging slightly in the winter wind. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get back in the car and drive away, to call the police. But Lucian was inside that house, weakened to the point where he could barely walk. I couldn't leave him. I pushed through the door as quietly as I could. The living room was empty, so was the kitchen. But I could hear voices coming from the guest room. Low voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. And beneath them, a sound that made my blood freeze. Lucian, breathing hard, like someone in terrible pain. I should have run. God help me, I should have run. But instead, I grabbed the largest knife from the kitchen block and crept down the hallway toward the guest room. The scene I found there will haunt me for the rest of my life. There were 4 of them, 3 men and 1 woman, all impossibly beautiful, all with that same otherworldly quality that marked Lucian as different. They'd arranged themselves around the room like they were attending a casual social gathering. The woman sat on the bed, examining her fingernails. 2 of the men leaned against the walls, looking bored, and the 4th, clearly their leader, stood directly in front of Lucian. Lucian was on his knees. They'd chained him somehow, thick iron chains that seemed to glow with a faint, sickly light. He was shaking, his head bowed, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him. The leader, who I immediately understood must be Severin, was magnificent in a terrible way. Tall, dark-haired, with features that looked carved from marble, but his eyes were empty, devoid of anything remotely human. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. He told Lucian that they'd been patient. They'd given him time to come to his senses, to realize the futility of his oath. But clearly, he remained delusional. So they'd tracked him here, to this pathetic hiding place, to offer him one final choice: feed properly, rejoin their kind, or they would kill not just him, but the human who'd been foolish enough to shelter him. That's when they noticed me standing in the doorway. The woman laughed. Not a human laugh, but something that seemed to echo from a great distance. She commented on how convenient it was that I'd arrived. Now, Lucian could make his choice in real time: feed on me and live, or watch me die and then die himself. Lucian raised his head then, and the look in his eyes when he saw me will stay with me forever. It wasn't fear. It was something far worse. It was guilt and love and despair all mixed together, and I understood in that moment that he'd been expecting this, that he'd known they would eventually find him, and that he'd stayed anyway, endangering me because some part of him hadn't wanted to face death alone. Severin moved toward me, and the speed of it was incomprehensible. One moment he was across the room, the next he had his hand around my throat, lifting me off the ground like I weighed nothing. My knife clattered uselessly to the floor. He held me up so Lucian could see me clearly. Then he spoke in English, presumably so I could understand my own death sentence. He explained that I had maybe 30 seconds of consciousness left before lack of oxygen to my brain caused irreversible damage. After that, I'd have minutes before my heart stopped. Lucian could save me if he chose. All he had to do was break his precious oath, take my blood, and accept his nature. Or he could let me die, and then die himself, having accomplished nothing except proving that his mercy was really just another form of cowardice. My vision was already starting to gray at the edges. I tried to speak, to tell Lucian not to do it, that I'd rather die than watch him destroy himself for me. But no sound came out. Severin's grip was absolute. Then I heard it, the sound of chains breaking. What happened next happened so fast I can barely piece it together. Lucian moved, and suddenly the iron chains were shattered on the ground. He was across the room, his hand wrapped around Severin's wrist, and the ancient vampire's confident expression had transformed into something approaching shock. Severin released me. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my throat burning. Through tears and darkness, I watched Lucian and Severin face each other. Severin seemed almost amused. He commented that Lucian had apparently found some hidden reserve of strength. Perhaps the protective instinct had triggered something dormant. He wondered aloud if Lucian had finally accepted what he was. If he was ready to abandon his foolish oath and return to the fold. Lucian's response was barely a whisper, but I heard it clearly. He told Severin that he'd made his choice a long time ago, that he would rather cease to exist than go back to being what he'd been, that some things were worth dying for. The other 3 vampires moved then, converging on Lucian from different angles. They were faster than anything I'd ever seen, but they seemed to move through water compared to Lucian. Weakened as he was, dying as he was, he met them with a grace and precision that spoke of centuries of experience. But it wasn't enough. There were too many of them, and he was too weak. I watched as they slowly overwhelmed him, dragging him down, their hands like claws tearing into him. Blood, impossibly dark blood, began to spread across the floor. I tried to help. I grabbed my knife from the floor and threw myself at the nearest vampire, the woman. It was like attacking a statue. She backhanded me casually, and I flew across the room, my head cracking against the wall hard enough to make stars explode across my vision. Through the haze of pain, I saw Severin standing over Lucien's broken form. He seemed disappointed. He commented that this was unfortunate, that Lucien had once been one of the strongest of their kind, that it was a waste to see him throw away centuries of existence for the sake of human morality. Then he turned to me. He informed me that I'd been an inconvenience, and that inconveniences needed to be eliminated. He told his companions to make it quick. The woman moved toward me, her mouth opening to reveal fangs that seemed to glow in the darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except close my eyes and wait for death. And then I heard Lucien scream, not in pain, in fury. When I opened my eyes, he was standing again, but he was different. His eyes burned with that crimson gold light, but now there was something else there, something primal and terrible. His body seemed to blur at the edges like he was moving faster than my eyes could track. What happened next was a massacre. He tore through them like they were made of paper. The woman who'd been about to kill me was thrown against the wall with such force that she left a crater in the plaster. One of the men tried to fight back and found himself missing an arm. The other fled, but Lucien was faster, dragging him back into the room by his throat. Only Severin remained standing, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in those empty eyes. He tried to speak, to negotiate, to explain that this was all just a misunderstanding. But Lucien wasn't listening. He grabbed Severin by the head and simply twisted. The sound was sickening. The ancient vampire's body hit the floor and then began to turn gray, then black, then crumbled into ash. The other three followed quickly. Lucien didn't give them a chance to flee or fight back. Within moments, my guest room was full of ash and the smell of something burning. Then Lucien turned to me, and I saw what he'd done. His mouth was covered in blood, fresh blood, human blood, my blood. At some point during the fight, when I'd been unconscious or disoriented, he'd fed on me. Not enough to kill me, but enough to restore his strength, to break his oath, to become again the thing he'd spent decades trying not to be. We stared at each other across the ash-filled room. I touched my neck and felt the twin wounds there, already starting to close with that same impossible healing I'd witnessed when I'd first found him. He told me he was sorry. He said the words over and over, like a prayer or a curse. He explained that I'd been dying, that Severin had broken something inside me when he'd thrown me against the wall, that he'd had seconds to decide whether to let me die or break his oath. He'd chosen me over his principles. And in doing so, he'd saved my life and destroyed the person he'd been trying to become. I should have been horrified. I should have run from that room, from that house, from him. But instead, I found myself crossing the space between us and wrapping my arms around him. He stood rigid in my embrace, his body cold and shaking, while I held him and told him it was okay, that I understood that he'd had no choice. But we both knew it wasn't okay. We both knew that something fundamental had shifted, that the careful balance we'd maintained for 2 months had shattered as completely as Severin's body. The weeks after that night were strange in a different way. Lucien was stronger now, physically. The weakness that had been slowly consuming him was gone, but something else had replaced it. A restlessness, a darkness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He cleaned up the guest room, removed every trace of what had happened there. He told me about vampire law, about how killing another vampire, especially one as old as Severin, would have consequences. More would come eventually. Not immediately, not tomorrow, but someday. Looking for answers. Looking for revenge. He said he should leave, that every day he stayed put me in more danger. that he'd already destroyed his moral code for me, and he wouldn't let me sacrifice my life as well. I told him to stay anyway. Maybe that makes me crazy. Maybe it makes me suicidal. But I'd spent so long being safe, being isolated, protecting myself from any possibility of being hurt, that the idea of going back to that empty existence felt worse than any physical danger. So he stayed, and we built a new normal. I went to work. He existed in my house, no longer dying, but not quite living either. We talked less than before. The easy companionship we'd developed had been complicated by what had happened, by what he'd been forced to do, by the blood connection that now existed between us. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night and find him standing in my doorway, just watching me sleep. He'd apologize and leave when he realized I was awake, but I knew what he was thinking, that my blood had tasted like salvation and damnation mixed together, that he was fighting every day not to take more, not to transform me into something like himself, not to give in completely to the nature he'd spent so long denying. I understood that fight. I was fighting my own battle, because part of me, the part that had been alone and numb for so long, wanted him to take more, wanted to blur the line between us completely, wanted to be transformed into something that could match his immortality, his existence outside normal human life. It's been 3 months now since the night as Severin came. Winter has given way to spring, though you wouldn't know it in this house. The seasons don't mean much to Lucian, and I've found myself increasingly detached from normal markers of time. I've stopped going to work. I called in sick for a week, then 2 weeks, then eventually just sent my resignation letter. My colleagues were concerned at first, then angry, then eventually just confused. They don't understand. How could they? The truth is, I can't leave this house anymore. Not because Lucian is keeping me here, but because out there, in the normal world, I feel like I'm suffocating, like I'm pretending to be something I'm not. The daylight hurts my eyes now. The noise of other people feels overwhelming. The only place I can breathe is here, in this isolated house with him. Lucian notices, of course. He's tried to talk to me about it, tried to convince me to reconnect with the world outside, but his arguments are hollow. How can he tell me to embrace humanity when he spent decades running from his own nature? How can he advocate for the life he couldn't live himself? Last night, he told me something he'd never mentioned before. He explained that when a vampire feeds on a human, especially repeatedly, it creates a bond. Not a physical bond exactly, but something deeper. The human begins to take on certain vampiric qualities, sensitivity to sunlight, changes in sleep patterns, an almost addictive need to be near the vampire who fed on them. He'd only fed on me once, that desperate night when Severin attacked. But vampire blood is powerful, and the wounds he'd made had injected his essence into my system. Slowly, gradually, I was changing, becoming something between human and vampire. Not immortal, not undead, but no longer quite mortal either. He told me this with tears in his eyes, actual tears, though I didn't think vampires could cry. He said he'd condemned me to a half-life, neither fully human nor vampire. That I would age slower than normal humans, but faster than him. That I would live perhaps twice as long as I should, spending those extra years watching everyone I knew die while remaining trapped in this twilight existence. He offered to fix it. There were ways, he said. Other vampires who might be able to reverse the process, or at least stop it from progressing further. But it would mean leaving, traveling to places where others of his kind gathered, putting ourselves in danger again. Kind of asked him what would happen if we did nothing, if we just let the bond continue, let the changes run their course. He looked away when he answered. He told me that eventually I would reach a tipping point. The changes would accelerate. I'd lose my ability to tolerate sunlight completely. Food would stop nourishing me, and I'd develop the hunger, the need for blood that defines what vampires are. At that point, he explained, I'd have two choices. Complete the transformation and become a full vampire, losing my humanity entirely, or resist the hunger and slowly starve, the way he'd been doing before I found him. Either way, the person I am now, the life I've lived, would be over. I should be terrified. I should be raging at him, blaming him for doing this to me. But I'm not. Because somewhere in the last few months, I stopped wanting to be the person I was. That person was broken, isolated, more dead than alive despite having a beating heart. This half-life Lucian has given me might be a curse, but it's also freed me from the prison I'd built around myself. The question is whether I have the courage to fully embrace it, or if I'll spend whatever time I have left trapped between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Lucian is waiting for my answer, waiting to know if I want him to try to save me from what he's made me, or if I want to let the transformation continue. But how do I explain to him that I don't see this as something to be saved from? That for the first time in years, I feel like I'm moving towards something instead of running away. The sun is rising now. I can feel it even though the curtains are drawn. A pressure against my skin like the world itself is pushing against me. Lucian has retreated to the guest room, to the darkness he needs to survive the day. But I'm still here, writing this, trying to make sense of everything that's happened. I think about that night on the highway, about finding him broken and dying in the rain, about the choice I made to stop, to help, to bring him into my life. Was it really my choice? Or was there always something inevitable about it? Two lost creatures finding each other in the darkness, recognizing in each other the same desperate need for connection, for meaning, for something more than just surviving. He broke his oath to save me. He gave up the moral code that had defined him for decades, because in that moment, my life mattered more to him than his principles. How do I respond to that kind of sacrifice? How do I honor it? Maybe the answer is that I don't. Maybe the only thing I can do is make my own choice, as terrible and irrevocable as his was. Choose to stay in this twilight world with him, or choose to return to the light and leave him behind in the darkness where he belongs. But even as I write that, I know it's not really a choice, because I'm already halfway gone, already more his than my own. Already bound to him by blood and need and something that might be love, or might be addiction, or might be both. The daylight is getting stronger. It's physically painful now, like needles pressing into my skin. I should close this notebook and retreat to the darkness. But I want to finish this thought. Want to record this moment when I'm still balanced between two worlds, still capable of seeing both sides clearly. Because soon, very soon, I'll have to make my final decision. And once I do, there won't be any going back. Lucian thinks he's cursed me. He thinks he's taken away my humanity, my future, my life. But what he doesn't understand is that I was already lost before I found him. I was already more dead than alive, going through the motions of existence without any real purpose or connection. He didn't take my life. He gave me a reason to want one. And now I have to decide what to do with that gift, however twisted and dark it might be. Do I fight to remain human? To preserve what's left of the person I was? Or do I surrender to what I'm becoming, embrace this half-life, maybe even complete the transformation, and join him fully in his eternal night? I look at my hands and they seem different somehow. Paler, the veins more visible, like they're glowing from within. Is that real? Or am I imagining it? Am I really changing? Or is this all just psychological? My mind convincing my body that it's becoming something it's not. Does it even matter? The line between physical and psychological reality has always been blurry. Maybe the transformation is as much about belief as it is about biology. Maybe by accepting what Lucian has made me, by stopping my resistance to the changes, I'm actively participating in my own transformation. There's a knock on my door. Lucian probably checking on me before The day forces him to retreat completely. I tell him to come in. He enters cautiously, like he's afraid of what he might find. The morning light streaming through the cracks in the curtains makes him look almost transparent, like he's fading away. But his eyes are as vivid as ever, that impossible crimson gold that first captured me all those months ago. He asks me if I've decided, if I want him to find a way to reverse what he's done. His voice is carefully neutral, but I can hear the hope underneath. Hope that I'll choose humanity, choose life, choose to leave him behind and return to the world I came from. But I can also hear the fear. Fear that I'll do exactly that he'll be alone again, that he'll have sacrificed his oath and gain nothing but more guilt and isolation. I close my notebook, stand up, walk toward him through the painful sunlight. And then I take his cold hand in my increasingly cold one. I tell him that I've made my choice, that I'm staying, that whatever I'm becoming, whatever we're becoming together, I want to see it through. The relief in his eyes is so profound, it's almost painful to witness. He tries to argue, tries to tell me that I don't understand what I'm giving up, what I'm accepting, but I stop him, because I understand better than he thinks. I spent years in medical school learning about life and death, about the biological processes that separate the living from the dead. But all of that knowledge couldn't prepare me for this, for the realization that existence is more complex than a beating heart or functioning lungs. Lucian has been technically dead for nearly 2 centuries, but he's more alive than I was in all my years of clinical, isolated existence. And now, poised on the edge of losing my humanity, I feel more present, more real, more connected than I ever did when I was fully human. So yes, I've made my choice. And I can see in his eyes that he's made his too. We're both surrendering to something bigger than ourselves, bigger than our individual pain and guilt and fear. We're choosing each other over everything else, and maybe that makes us monsters. Or maybe it makes us more human than either of us has been in a very long time. The sunlight is unbearable now. We retreat together to the guest room, to the darkness where he's been hiding, where I'll learn to hide too. He closes the heavy curtains, sealing out the day, and we sit together on the bed where I first treated his impossible wounds. He tells me stories to pass the hours until night falls again, stories about all the lives he's lived, all the versions of himself he's been, the monster, the hermit, the oath keeper, and now, maybe, something new, something neither of us has a name for yet. I listen, and I realize that I'm adding my own story to his collection. The isolated doctor who found connection in the most impossible place. The rational scientist who chose supernatural love over mundane existence. The human who looked at immortality and decided it might be worth the cost. As evening approaches, and I feel the pressure of daylight beginning to ease, Lucian asks me a question he's never asked before. He wants to know why I really stopped that night. Why I helped him instead of calling for an ambulance and driving away. I think about lying, about giving him the reasons I've told myself all these months. But we're past that now. Past pretense and self-deception. So I tell him the truth. I tell him that when I saw him lying there in the rain, broken and dying, I saw myself. Not physically, but essentially. We were both casualties of our own choices, both trapped by guilt and isolation, both more dead than alive despite our technical status among the living. I tell him that I stopped because saving him felt like maybe, just maybe, I could save myself too. That if I could pull him back from death, perhaps I could figure out how to pull myself back from the living death I'd been inhabiting. And it worked, I explain. Not in the way I expected. Not by bringing me back to my old life or healing the wounds that made me retreat from the world, but by showing me that there were other ways to exist, other forms of connection, other possibilities beyond the binary of life and death. Human and monster, isolation and integration. Lucian is silent for a long time after I finish. Then he tells me something I never expected to hear. He says that when he opened his eyes on that highway and saw me standing over him, soaked in rain and covered in his blood. He'd felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Hope. Not hope that he'd survive his injuries. He'd been ready to die, had accepted it, maybe even welcomed it. But hope that maybe in his last moments, he'd be seen by someone who looked at him with something other than fear or disgust. Someone who chose to help despite the impossibility of the situation. He says that hope kept him alive when he should have died, that it gave him a reason to fight the weakness, to accept my help, to stay when every instinct told him to disappear back into the darkness where he'd been hiding for so long. We saved each other that night, he tells me, not from death, but from the slower, more insidious process of forgetting what connection feels like, of accepting isolation as inevitable, of giving up on the possibility that existence could be more than just surviving. The last of the daylight fades, and we emerge from the guest room together. The house looks different in the darkness, more honest somehow. During the day, you can pretend that everything is normal, that this is just a regular house inhabited by regular people. But at night, the pretense falls away, and you can see it for what it really is. A sanctuary, a hiding place, a pocket of existence removed from normal reality where two damaged creatures have found unexpected peace. Lucian offers to teach me about my new reality, how to manage the changes, how to exist in this liminal space between human and vampire, how to navigate a world that wasn't designed for what I'm becoming. I accept, not because I'm afraid of the transformation, but because I want to understand it. Want to embrace it fully rather than stumbling through it blind. As we stand together in the darkness of my living room, I realize that I no longer know exactly what I am. Not fully human, not quite vampire. Something in between, something undefined. And strangely, I'm okay with that. Because maybe that's what we all are, really, undefined. Somewhere between what we were and what we're becoming. Straddling multiple realities, never quite fitting into any single category. The difference is that most people don't have to acknowledge it. They can pretend to fit neatly into boxes, to have clear identities, to know exactly who and what they are. But Lucine and I have had that pretense stripped away. We're forced to confront the messy reality of existing between worlds, between definitions, between life and death. And maybe that's not a curse. Maybe it's a gift. The freedom to define ourselves on our own terms, to reject the categories that never quite fit, to create something new from the ruins of what we used to be. I think about the woman I was when I found Lucian on that highway, isolated, numb, going through the motions of existence, without any real purpose or joy. That woman is gone now, transformed as completely as if she'd died and been reborn. But I don't mourn her, because the person I'm becoming, whatever that is, feels more authentic than she ever did. More connected, more alive, paradoxically, now that I'm losing my humanity. Lucian takes my hand, and I marvel at how similar our skin temperature has become. We're matching now, two cold creatures seeking warmth in each other's presence. He asks me if I'm afraid of what comes next. I tell him yes. Of course I'm afraid. But I'm also curious, excited, ready to see what this transformation looks like, what kind of existence we can build together in the spaces between human and vampire, life and death, isolation and connection. We stand at the window together, looking out at the dark woods surrounding the house. Somewhere out there, the normal world continues its normal existence. People wake up, go to work, have relationships, grow old, die. The whole cycle of ordinary human life spinning on without us. And here in this isolated house at the end of a gravel driveway, we're creating something different. Something that doesn't have a name yet. A relationship, maybe, though that word feels too small for what we're building. A partnership between a vampire trying to remember how to be human and a human trying to figure out how to stop being one. I don't know how this story ends. I don't know if others of Lucian's kind will come looking for revenge. I don't know how far my transformation will progress, or whether I'll eventually choose to complete it. I don't know if we'll stay hidden in this house forever, or eventually venture back into the world. But for the first time in years, I'm okay with not knowing, because the not knowing means possibility. It means that the future is unwritten, that we get to decide what happens next, that we're not trapped by predetermined definitions or expectations. Lucian broke his oath to save me. I'm abandoning my humanity to stay with him. And somewhere in the balance of those two sacrifices, we found something that might be redemption, or might be damnation, or might be both at once. As I write these final words, I can feel the changes accelerating. My reflection in the window is getting fainter. The darkness feels less like an absence and more like a presence, something I'm learning to inhabit rather than fear. And the hunger Lucian warned me about is starting to make itself known, a hollow ache that normal food no longer satisfies. I'm standing at the threshold of my final transformation. Soon, I'll have to make the ultimate choice, resist the hunger and slowly fade like Lucian was doing, or embrace it fully and become something new, something that was never fully human to begin with maybe, or something that's more human than the isolated, disconnected person I used to be. But tonight, I'm not making that choice. Tonight, I'm simply existing in this moment, in this house, with this impossible creature who taught me that there are worse things than monsters. Things like loneliness, things like isolation, things like going through an entire life without ever truly connecting with another being. The night is fully dark now. Lucian suggests we go outside, into the woods, so he can show me how to move through the world as something other than human. I agree, and we step out into the cold air together. As we disappear into the trees, I take one last look back at the house, at the life I'm leaving behind, at the person I used to be, and then I turn away and follow Lucian into the darkness. Not because I'm running from something, but because I'm running toward it, toward uncertainty, toward transformation, toward a future I can't predict, but I'm finally brave enough to face. I don't know if I'm still alive in any meaningful sense. I don't know if I've already crossed over into whatever exists on the other side of humanity. I don't know if what I feel for Lucian is love or obsession, or the inevitable result of our blood bond. But I know that for the first time in years, I want to find out. I want to see what comes next. I want to discover what kind of creature emerges from the chrysalis of my former life. And maybe that's all any of us can ask for, really. To want, to hope, to step into the unknown with someone who understands what it means to be lost, to be damned, to be saved, all at the same time. The trees close around us, and I hear Lucian's voice in the darkness, telling me to close my eyes and feel the night, to let go of my human perceptions and embrace the new senses that are slowly awakening within me. I do as he says, and suddenly the world explodes into clarity. I can hear heartbeats of creatures I never knew existed. I can smell the life pulsing through the forest, feel the subtle vibrations of a world that was always there, but that I was too human to perceive. And I realize that this is what I've been moving toward all along. Not death, but a different kind of life. Not an ending, but a transformation. Not a loss of self, but a discovery of all the selves I could be. Lucian takes my hand again, and we move through the forest together. Two creatures existing between worlds, between definitions, between what we were and what we're becoming. And as we disappear into the night, I can't help but smile, because I finally understand what he meant when he said that some things are worth dying for. He was wrong, though. This isn't about dying, it's about living. Really living for the first time in my existence. Even if that life looks nothing like what I imagined. Even if it means giving up everything I thought defined me. Even if it means existing in the spaces between human understanding and a reality most people will never see. The hunger grows stronger as we move deeper into the woods. Soon, I'll have to face it. Soon, I'll have to decide whether to resist or surrender. Soon, all of this will come to some kind of conclusion, but not tonight. Tonight, I'm still balanced on the edge, still partly human, partly something else, still able to look at both worlds with clear eyes. And from this vantage point, I can see the truth that neither world wants to acknowledge. That we're all monsters and angels simultaneously. That isolation is the real curse, not immortality or mortality or any condition of existence. That love, in all its twisted and beautiful forms, is the only thing that matters in the end. Lucian asks me if I'm ready to see what I've become. I tell him yes, knowing that the answer will change everything, that there's no going back from this moment. He leads me to a still pond deep in the forest, where the moonlight reflects off the surface like liquid silver, and he tells me to look. I kneel at the water's edge, my heart pounding with something that might be fear or excitement or both. And I look at my reflection for the first time since the night everything changed. And I see ... the reflection is there. Faint, translucent, but present. I'm not fully vampire yet, not fully gone. But I'm not entirely human either. I exist in the space between, visible but insubstantial, present but fading. I look up at Lucian and he's watching me with those impossible eyes, waiting to see how I'll react. Waiting to see if I'll run, if I'll break down, if I'll reject what I'm becoming. Instead, I laugh, a real laugh, from deep in my chest, the first genuine laugh I've produced in years. Because it's perfect, really. I'm not one thing or another. I'm both and neither. I'm exactly what I've always been, just more visible now. Lucian looks confused, maybe even worried. But I stand up and take his hand again, and I tell him that I finally understand. That this liminal existence, this in-between state, isn't a curse. It's the truth. We're all between worlds. Between who we were and who we're becoming. Between life and death, connection and isolation, salvation and damnation. The only difference is that most people never have to see it clearly, but we do. And maybe that's our gift, not our curse. As we walk back toward the house together, I realize that I've stopped worrying about the future. Stopped trying to predict or control what comes next. Because whatever happens, we'll face it together. Two impossible creatures who found each other in the darkness and decided that was enough. And maybe it is enough. Maybe that's all any of us really needs. Someone to see us. Someone to accept us. Someone to stand beside us in the liminal spaces where we truly exist. The house appears through the trees, warm lights glowing in the windows. A sanctuary. A hiding place. A home. We step inside and I close the door behind us. The outside world, with all its definitions and expectations and normal realities, stays outside where it belongs. And here, in this space we've created together, we exist. Not human, not vampire, not alive in any conventional sense, but not dead either. Just ... existing. Together. In all our messy, impossible, beautiful complexity. And somehow, that's more than enough. It's everything. The end.